Wyoming Territory, January 1883. The snow had not let up in 3 days, and by the time Travis O'Bannon spotted the shape crumpled under the cottonwoods, he figured it was too late. He swung down from his saddle, boots crunching in the deep white, and hurried toward the bundle. The wind clawed at his coat as he knelt beside what looked like a broken wagon, half buried by snowdrift. A dead horse lay a few feet off, frozen stiff. But it was the sound that stopped him cold. A baby's cry. He dropped to his knees faster and tore at the snow-covered tarp. His fingers were stiff, his breath white. Underneath, a woman lay curled around 2 infants, her hair tangled and rimmed in ice. Her wool shawl was spread thin over all 3 of them as if she had tried to shield them with everything she had left. "Ma'am," Travis said, voice low but urgent. "Hey ma'am, can you hear me?" One of the babies fussed again, a soft wail of hunger and cold. The woman stirred, barely, her face pale as paper. Her lips moved. "Please," she whispered, eyes fluttering open. "My babies?" Travis did not waste another second. He pulled his heavy coat off and wrapped it around all 3 of them. Then he scooped the infants up into one-armed twins, no more than a few months old, and lifted the woman into the other. She was light as a sack of flour, her body limp against his chest. "My cabin's close," he said, more to himself than her. "You hold on. You are not dying today." He whistled for his horse, hoisted all 3 of them into the saddle, and climbed up behind. The wind whistled through the trees, but he leaned forward, shielding them with his body, and rode hard through the snow. By the time he reached his cabin, the sky was dark as slate and his gloves soaked through. He carried them inside, shut the door with his boot, and went straight to the hearth. The fire was low but alive. He laid the babies on a quilt beside it, stripped off their frozen blankets, and wrapped them in dry ones. One was still crying softly, but the other was quiet, blinking up at him with wide, glassy eyes. He turned back to the woman. She sat slumped on the floor where he had set her down, her skin gray and lips trembling. "You are all right," he said, kneeling by her. "You are safe now. I am Travis. What is your name?" She blinked at him, dazed, and swallowed. "Phoebe," she whispered. "Phoebe Prescott." "Phoebe." He said it again, gently. "You are burning up, Phoebe. We need to get you warm." She tried to move, but her arms gave out. "The babies Zadie and Zeke they need. They are all right. Focus on yourself first." He helped her out of the wet clothes and wrapped her in a thick buffalo robe. She winced when he touched her shoulder, and he noticed bruising there old, yellowed. He did not ask. Not yet. He warmed broth from the pot over the fire and held it to her lips. She sipped it slowly, eyes fluttering closed again. By the time the wind died outside, the fire had grown strong and hot. The babies were asleep, curled together on the quilt. Phoebe lay on the cot with another blanket tucked around her, color slowly returning to her cheeks. Travis sat in the old rocking chair, watching the 3 of them. His chest felt tight, but not in a bad way, just full. He had not expected this day to bring anything but cold and silence. But now, his cabin was full of breath and life and the soft sound of sleeping children. The next morning, Travis was chopping firewood when he heard the door creak open behind him. Phoebe stood just inside, one hand on the frame. Her dark hair was clean now, pulled back into a braid, and she wore one of his spare shirts tied at the waist. "You should not be up yet," he said, wiping his brow. She looked down, then back up at him. "I needed to say thank you. You saved us." "You do not need to thank me." "Yes, I do." Her voice shook. "If you had not come when you did." He dropped the axe and crossed the snow to her. "You are safe now. That is what matters." Her eyes filled, but she nodded quickly and stepped aside to let him back inside. The warmth of the fire hit him like a wall. "I do not know how to repay you," she said softly, watching the babies sleep in the corner. "I have nothing left. You do not need to repay me." He looked at the twins. "What happened, Phoebe?" She took a breath. "My husband died in October. Fever took him fast. We were heading west from Cheyenne, trying to find work. I thought I could make it to my cousin's place near Lander. But the snow came early, the wagon broke, and her voice cracked. I thought we were going to die out there. Travis looked at her long and steady. You are not going to die. Not here. She met his eyes. Her lip trembled, but she nodded. I do not want to be a burden. You are not. He said it like a fact. Stay as long as you need. Phoebe stared at him, then turned to the twins. Zeke, he likes to be held when he wakes. Zadie is quieter, but she misses her father. She cries sometimes in her sleep. I will learn. Travis smiled, slow and sure. I can help. Phoebe looked over at him, and for the first time, she smiled too. For the next few days, the storm kept them in. Travis taught Phoebe how to stoke the fire just right, how to split kindling without splinters. She taught him how to rock Zeke gently when he fussed and how to soothe Zadie with a lullaby soft as snow. They shared meals, quiet evenings, and the kind of talks that came easy when you had nowhere else to be. One night, as the wind howled outside, Travis handed Phoebe a tin cup of tea. Their hands brushed. She looked at him, eyes tired but warm. You have been so kind. He shook his head. You all brought something into this place I did not even know was missing. Phoebe blinked, surprised. What was missing? Hope, he said, simple and true. She looked down at her tea, then back at him. You gave us that first. They sat close by the fire, the light flickering across their faces. And when Zeke stirred in his sleep and Phoebe rose to check on him, she paused beside Travis and touched his shoulder. Good night, Travis. He looked up at her, his voice low. Good night, Phoebe. Her hand lingered for a moment longer than it needed to, and when she turned to go, he watched her with something new blooming in his chest. Something warm, something steady, something like love. The first thaw came quiet and slow in early February. Snow still rimmed the hills, but icicles began to drip from the eaves and the sky softened to a pale, expectant blue. Travis noticed it first in the way the creek behind the cabin started to murmur again, water slipping beneath the ice like a secret making its way home. He was repairing the latch on the barn door when he heard Phoebe's voice from the edge of the porch. I can take the wash today, she said, arms folded against the chill. You've been splitting wood since before sunup. Travis glanced up, then brushed a curl of hair from his forehead with the back of his wrist. You sure you feel up for that? I can manage a few shirts and diapers, she said, stepping down onto the packed snow. Zadie's napping. Zeke just fussed himself to sleep. I've got an hour if I'm lucky. He handed her the small tin basin already half full with warmed water. I don't mind sharing the chores. Her eyes met his steady. I know. That's why I want to. They worked in companionable silence, she on the back stoop with the washboard, he replacing a broken hinge on the barn door. The rhythm of it all felt like something new being built, a quiet order neither of them had asked for but both welcomed with a kind of cautious gratitude. Later that afternoon, Phoebe sat near the hearth sewing a patch onto one of the baby's shirts, while Travis carved a new handle for the coffee mill. The babies lay nearby, Zeke chewing on a strip of cloth, Zadie watching the flicker of firelight, her small hands twitching. I used to think I couldn't live without noise, Phoebe said suddenly, her needle pausing mid-stitch. We had neighbors back in Topeka, friends dropping by, children shouting from the alley. I thought quiet meant something was wrong. Travis glanced at her from the corner of his eye. And now, she smiled faintly, now it feels like breathing. He nodded once, the sound of his knife scraping against the wood steady and sure. There's peace in it sometimes. Phoebe set her sewing down. Did you always live out here? Since I was 16, he said. My uncle had a spread north of Casper. I worked cattle with him a while. After he passed, I drifted. Found this place 3 years back. Why stay? He looked at the fire for a long moment. Didn't figure there was anyone waiting for me anywhere else. Phoebe didn't speak right away. Then carefully, it's strange. All this time, I kept thinking I was heading towards something. A job, a roof, a chance. but I never stopped long enough to see if I'd already passed something worth holding onto. Travis set the knife down. You didn't pass it. You're here now. Phoebe's hand brushed Zadie's forehead. I don't know what comes next. You don't have to. He leaned back in the chair, his gaze steady. You just have to stay. The fire crackled between them, and outside, a raven called once, sharp and distant. That night, Zeke woke with a dry cough. Phoebe rose quickly, lifting him and humming something soft under her breath. Travis lit a lantern and stirred the coals, heating a kettle to make a steam tent. I used to do this with my youngest sister, he said, holding the cloth over the pot as Phoebe rocked Zeke close to the warmth. She'd get croup every winter. Phoebe's brow furrowed as she watched the steam rise. Did she grow out of it? She did. He offered a smile, brief but honest. She married a millwright in Colorado Springs. Wrote me once to say their first boy looked just like her pa. Phoebe glanced at him then, something quiet and curious in her expression. You never married? No, he said simply. Didn't seem like there was much of me that someone wanted to keep. Her eyes didn't leave his. That's not true. He didn't answer, but the way he looked at her open, unguarded said he heard her. Morning came with gold light through the window panes and the sound of a woodpecker tapping somewhere beyond the trees. Travis had gone out early to check the trap line. When he returned, Phoebe was kneeling by the hearth coaxing the fire with a bundle of tinder. You always up this early? He asked, brushing snow from his shoulders. She turned, her braids slipping over her shoulder. Used to be. With the babies, sometimes it's the only hour I get to myself. He hung his coat and set a brace of rabbits on the table. You get your hour today? She stood and wiped her hands on her skirt. I watched the sun come up. That counts. They cleaned the rabbits together, Phoebe handling the knife with practiced care. Travis watched her hands, deft and sure. You've done this before, he said. I grew up near Council Grove. My brothers hunted when they could. We all learned how to dress meat before we could spell half the words for it. He laughed, then caught himself. Sorry. No, she said, smiling. I like the sound of it. He looked down, suddenly self-conscious. Don't laugh much these days. Maybe you should, she said, glancing at him sidelong. It suits you. Zadie stirred just then, and Phoebe crossed the room to lift her from the cradle. The baby's hands reached instinctively for her mother's face. Travis watched them, something unspoken moving behind his eyes. Phoebe glanced over her shoulder. What is it? He shook his head. Just thinking how quick things change. A month ago, this place was just boards and quiet. And now, he stepped closer, voice low. Now it's more than I ever thought it could be. Phoebe didn't answer right away. Then she stepped toward him, still holding Zadie close, and reached up with her free hand to touch his sleeve. I think, she said gently, you were waiting for someone, even if you didn't know it. They stood like that for a long moment, the fire warm behind them, the baby's breath soft between them. Neither of them moved away. By late February, the trees had begun to whisper again. Bare cottonwood swayed in the breeze, their limbs creaking like old bones waking from sleep. Travis was fitting new planks into the lean-to when Phoebe stepped out with Zadie bundled against her chest, her free hand shading her eyes from the pale sun. There's a hawk circling out past the ridge, she said, watching the sky. Zeke saw it first, pointed like he'd seen heaven open. Travis followed her gaze. Red-tailed? They nest on the western slope, come down this way when the rabbits start running again. She adjusted the sling over her shoulder, tucking Zadie's little hand beneath the wrap. I used to think birds were just birds. Now I watch them like they're trying to tell me something. He set the hammer down. They usually are. Phoebe turned her face toward him. What do you think that one's saying? That spring's closer than we think. She smiled at that, then looked toward the woods. I've been thinking about planting something. Once the ground softens. Beans, maybe? Or carrots. He wiped his hands on his trousers. There's a patch behind the cabin that gets full sun. Wasn't much use to me before. Would you mind if I tried? It's yours to grow. Phoebe looked down at Zadie, who had begun to twitch in her sleep. I like the idea of roots. Later that week, when the sun stayed longer and the air warmed enough for the door to stay open through the afternoon, Travis returned from the creek with a bucket of fish and found Phoebe humming while she mended one of his shirts. Zeke sat beside her on the floor, beating a wooden spoon against an empty tin like a drummer in his own parade. "You've got a helper there," Travis said, setting the bucket down. "He insists on being involved in everything," she said, her tone light. "Yesterday he tried to eat a candle stub. He's got grit. He's got something." Travis crouched by the hearth, rubbing the back of his neck. "Phoebe, I've been thinking. If you ever wanted to write your cousin, I've got paper and ink in the drawer. The post comes through the valley once a month." She didn't answer right away. Then she set the needle down. "I did think of it at first, but I don't even know if she's still there. And when I picture leaving this place." She trailed off, her gaze returning to Zeke. "You don't have to explain," he said. "But I want to." She pulled her knees up and wrapped her arms around them. "When I left Cheyenne, I thought I was chasing a promise. That somewhere someone would take us in. But no letter came. No one was waiting." Travis sat beside her on the floor, their backs to the fire. "You deserve more than waiting." "I don't know what I deserve." She looked at him then, her voice low. "But I know what I want." The air shifted between them. Zeke quieted, the tin falling from his hands. Phoebe reached out slowly, her fingers brushing against Travis's. He didn't pull away. The days wore longer after that. They fell into a rhythm neither of them spoke aloud but both felt in the bones. Phoebe took to kneading bread in the mornings, her sleeves rolled high in flour dusting her forearms. Travis would step in from the barn, boots muddy, and pause in the doorway just to watch her work. One evening she found him sanding the cradle he'd built from pine for the twins. The old apple box they'd used until then sat empty beside the hearth. "You made that," she said, running her hand along the smooth edge. "They'll outgrow it in a year," he said. "But it'll hold for now." She looked up at him. "You didn't have to do this." "I wanted to." Phoebe stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "You always want to make things better, don't you? I just don't want you to feel alone in it." She reached for his hand then, not tentative this time. Her grip was certain. "I haven't. Not in weeks." When March came, the snow retreated in patches, revealing brown earth and the promise of green beneath. Travis plowed the back garden with the old mule he'd traded for last summer, and Phoebe followed behind, marking rows with a branch. Zadie strapped to her front, Zeke toddling behind with a stick of his own. They rested in the grass afterward, sharing cold biscuits and soft cheese, the sun warm on their faces. "I used to dream of a house with a white fence," Phoebe said, lying back beside him. "Porch swing. Piano maybe." "Never had much use for a piano," Travis said, squinting at the sky. "But I could manage a swing." She turned her head toward him. "Would you build one? If you'd sit in it." The breeze stirred the grass around them and Zeke let out a delighted squeal as he rolled down the short hill toward the fence post. Phoebe laughed, sitting up to check on him. Travis watched her, a feeling rising in him that had no name he'd ever used, but it sat deep and quiet in his chest. That night, after the babies had settled and the fire burned low, Phoebe stood by the window, arms folded. "You know what I realized today?" she asked. He looked up from the chair, his eyes soft in the firelight. "I haven't thought about leaving in over a month." He rose slowly, walking over until he stood behind her. "You don't have to." She turned, looking up at him. "I don't want to." He reached for her then, his hand resting lightly at her waist. "Phoebe, I've never known how to ask for something I wanted. But if I could ask now," she leaned in, her forehead against his. "You don't have to ask." When he kissed her, it was slow and sure, like something that had waited long enough. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, and inside, two people stood still, wrapped in the warmth of something neither of them had expected, but both of them knew to be real. The cradle rocked gently in the corner, and the fire burned steady into the night. By the middle of March, the soil behind the cabin had turned soft underfoot. Phoebe knelt in the garden as she pressed bean seeds into the dark rows, her sleeves rolled high and her knees damp with earth. Zadie slept on a quilt nearby, cheeks flushed from the warmth of the sun, while Zeke sat beside his sister, poking at a stick with grave attention. Travis stood at the edge of the fence line, tightening wire around a cedar post. He paused to watch Phoebe brush a curl of hair from her cheek with the back of her wrist, her eyes narrowed against the sun, her fingers sure in the dirt. "You've got a farmer's touch," he called over. She looked up, squinting. "I think it's more stubbornness than skill." He set the wire cutters down and leaned on the post. "That kind of stubborn's the only thing that keeps anything growing out here." She sat back on her heels, brushing dust from her palms. "I used to help my father with the garden when I was little. He'd whistle the same tune every time he planted." "What was it?" She tilted her head. "Something about a riverboat." "I never caught all the words." Travis smiled, then climbed through the fence and crossed the yard. "You hum when you're working. You know that." Her brows lifted. "I do not." "You do. Same thing every time. Sounds like a lullaby." She looked down at the seed packet in her lap. "It's the one my mother sang when I had fever. I suppose it stuck." He knelt beside her, resting his arms on his knees. "Funny how those things stay, even when everything else changes." Phoebe didn't answer. She stared at the dirt a moment, then picked up another handful of seeds. "I had a dream last night," she said as she worked. "We were living in a little house with a sloped roof and a line of laundry dancing in the wind. Zeke was chasing chickens. You were building a fence that didn't need building." He looked at her closely. "Was it a good dream?" She nodded. "I woke up and thought it was real." He picked up a small rock and rolled it between his fingers. "Maybe someday it will be." Phoebe glanced at him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she said, "You'd stay even with two little ones underfoot?" "I'd stay because of them," he said. "And because of you." That night, after the babies were tucked into the cradle and the lanterns trimmed low, Phoebe stood at the table smoothing a scrap of paper against the wood. Travis came in quietly, drying his hands on a cloth. "You writing something?" he asked. She didn't look up. "Trying to remember my father's tune. I thought if I wrote the notes down, I might find the rest." He pulled out the chair across from her. "You play." "I used to. We had a pump organ. I wasn't much good, but I liked the feel of the keys under my hands." He watched her fingers trace invisible notes on the table. "If I ever find one at auction, I'll haul it home on my back if I have to." She laughed softly, then grew quiet again. "There's still a part of me that wonders if this will last." Travis leaned forward. "What makes you doubt it?" She folded the paper in half with careful precision. "Because I've lost before, and because this feels too good to be true." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "I can't promise nothing bad will ever find us, but I can promise I'll stay." She looked at their joined hands, then up at him. "Do you think they'll remember any of this? The babies?" He thought a moment. "Not the days, maybe, but the way you hold them, the way you sing. They'll carry that." Phoebe's throat moved as she swallowed. "I want them to grow up knowing what safety feels like." "They will," he said. "You've already given it to them." That Sunday, a horse and rider appeared on the ridge at first light. Travis stepped out, rifle in hand, but lowered it when he recognized the shape. It was Emery Watts, a trapper who passed through twice a year to trade pelts and news. He dismounted slowly, his coat stiff with dust and beard thick with wind. "Heard someone was living out here again. Wasn't planning on it until January," Travis said, shaking his hand. "Come in. Coffee's hot." Inside, Phoebe held Zeke on her hip and offered a nod of greeting. Emery raised a brow at the sight of her, then at the cradle behind the stove. "Well," he said, settling onto the bench, "didn't expect to find a proper family cooked up out here." "We're figuring it out," Travis said evenly. Emery glanced between them, then lowered his voice. "You planning to stay come summer?" "We are," Phoebe said before Travis could answer. Emery nodded once. "Good. Nearest town's growing. They're talking about a schoolhouse. Somebody'll need to run it." Phoebe looked up sharply. "They're hiring." "Not yet," Emery said. "But they will. And they'll want someone who can read and keep order." Travis saw the way her eyes lit just slightly. After Emery left, the cabin fell quiet again. "You thinking of it?" he asked later as they shelled peas by the window. Maybe, she said. If the twins are old enough to be left a few hours, I could teach again. It's something I know. He touched her wrist, gentle. If it's what you want, we'll make it work. She nodded, eyes soft. I want to build something solid, not just survive. We already are, he said. Bit by bit. Outside, the wind stirred the garden rose, and the sun slipped low behind the hills. Somewhere in the trees, a whippoorwill called, and the cradle in the corner rocked slow and steady with the rhythm of two sleeping children. By the first week of April, the last of the ice had vanished from the creek, and the cottonwoods along the edge of the meadow began putting out cautious green buds. The garden rows behind the cabin showed signs of life, small, purposeful shoots pushing up through the dirt. Phoebe stood barefoot near the edge of the patch, her hem muddy, a quiet smile playing across her face as she pressed a hand to her lower back and stretched slowly. From where he stood by the chicken hutch, Travis noticed the way she moved, slower than usual, favoring one hip. He crossed the yard, wiping his hands on his trousers. You all right? She turned to him with a nod. Just stiff. Zeke's taken to climbing everything, and Zadie's teething. I feel like I haven't sat still in 3 days. Come on, he said, offering his hand. Let's find you a place to rest. She hesitated, then took it. He led her to the porch where the swing he'd hung from the rafters last week waited. She eased down into it with a grateful sigh. He sat beside her. The swing creaked gently as they moved. Birds called from the trees beyond the rise, and somewhere down in the hollow, water trickled over stone. Didn't think you'd actually build it, Phoebe said, resting her head lightly against his shoulder. You asked, he said. I only mentioned it. That was enough. They sat quietly for a while, watching the light shift across the mountains. Then Phoebe said, I've been thinking about the marriage license. Travis didn't speak, but his posture changed still, attentive. I know we've said we don't need paper to make this real, she continued. But I want the children to grow up without question. I want our name on things to match. He turned to her. I'd like that too. She looked down at her hands. I didn't want to rush you, after everything. You didn't, he said. I've been waiting for the right time to ask. Her eyes lifted to his. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small, folded envelope. Emery gave me this when he passed through. I asked him to fetch it from Lander on his way back, license, signed by the circuit judge. Just needed us to decide when. Phoebe took the envelope, her hands trembling slightly, and opened it. She ran her fingers gently across the paper. I guess we've decided, she said softly. Travis reached for her hand. Tomorrow morning. I'll ride out with you and the twins to the chapel in town. Her voice caught. You sure you want to make a trip just for that? I'd ride twice that far. And I want folks to know you're mine. She leaned in and kissed him, slow and certain. Then I'll wear the blue dress. They rose at first light the next morning. Phoebe packed a small satchel with clothes for the babies, a comb, and the blue ribbon she'd saved from her wedding to Eli, now tied around Zadie's favorite cloth doll. She held it for a moment, then tucked it away. Travis hitched the wagon while she dressed the children. Zeke clapped as he was lifted into the back, and Zadie blinked at the rising sun, her mouth working around a scrap of biscuit. The road into town was still rutted in places, but the weather held. They reached the chapel by noon, the wooden building standing quiet against a backdrop of greening hills and soft sky. The schoolteacher, Martha Kane, a widow herself, stood witness, holding Zeke on her hip while Phoebe and Travis stood before the preacher. Zadie slept in the crook of Phoebe's arm, her head nestled against her mother's collar. I've never seen him look so solemn, Martha whispered, nodding at Travis. Phoebe smiled. He's thinking it through. I think he's already thought it through. The preacher cleared his throat and they turned to face one another. Travis's hands were rough and warm in hers, his eyes steady. You brought us back, he said, voice low. I didn't know I was waiting for you, but I was. Phoebe's breath caught. You gave us a place to belong. I never thought I'd feel safe again. The preacher's final words were simple. The kiss they shared was quiet, deep, and full of everything they didn't say aloud. Afterward, They walked back to the wagon hand in hand, the babies nestled between them. Martha waved them off with a knowing smile. By the time they reached home, the sun had dipped behind the trees. Travis carried Zeke in one arm, Phoebe held Zadie close, and their home stood warm and waiting, smoke curling from the chimney. Inside, they lit the lanterns and settled the children into their cradle. Phoebe turned to Travis and rested her head against his chest. "This feels like the start of something," she said. "It is," he said, "and it's ours." He led her to the swing and they sat together, the night warm enough now for open air. She rested her head on his shoulder and he wrapped an arm around her waist. "I want more," she said after a long silence. He looked down at her. "More what?" "More of this. More mornings with you. More seasons. More years." "You'll have them," he said. "Every one." They sat until the stars came out, the land around them quiet but full of life. Years later, that swing would still hang from the porch beam, the wood worn smooth by time. The garden grew thick every spring, and the twins ran wild through the meadow, their laughter chasing the wind. Phoebe taught at the small schoolhouse 3 days a week, and Travis built furniture that folks came from 2 counties over to buy. They grew older but never apart. Every evening, they met on the porch as the sun sank low, her hand in his, their hearts steady, their home full. And in all the years that followed, neither one of them ever forgot the sound of the snow melting for the first time or the way it felt to find love where only silence had lived before.